I read The 11th Metal by Brandon Sanderson for the summer of Cosmere, where I am reading all of the Cosmere stories in their published order and talking about the connections between them. So this will include possible spoilers for The Alloy of Law, Warbreaker, The Way of Kings, the Mistborn trilogy, and Elantris. And this short story explains what happened to Kelsier before the events of the Mistborn trilogy when he had first gotten his powers, and then he runs into a mentor named Gemmel who teaches him how to use all of his abilities. And so we get to see Kelsier, like when he's not very talented at steel pushing and fighting hand to hand, with his pewter powers and stuff like that. And it's really interesting how he tries to use emotional allomancy a lot. And Gemmel really pushes him against that and tries to get him to use the more brutal physical metals. And the Kelsier that we get to know in the trilogy is that is his speciality, is those physical metals. And he really downplays any ability. He thinks of himself as being really clumsy with emotional allomancy. And so it's interesting to see that reversal in this story and what it could possibly mean. Coming to this story after you know everything that you do from the Mistborn trilogy makes it really obvious that Gemmel is in some kind of conversation with Ruin. And so Ruin is planting the seeds of all of Kelsier's plans for the future, like fighting the Lord Ruler, introducing him to the 11th Metal through the events of the story. And it's all very subtle, but also teaching him to be so brutal in his fighting style, to be so violent, and to give in to the feelings of resentment and hatred that he has towards the nobleman. All of those elements are necessary for Ruin's plan to unfold successfully the way that it does in the story. And we can see a kind of origin point here. But if you read this story, and I think that you could read this story before you read the Mistborn trilogy, it would be successful. The story would work, but these details would kind of fly over your head and you wouldn't see the way in which, Ruin is manipulating things so subtly and carefully. And I think that's really important because it speaks to the way in which these parts of Kelsier, he becomes this larger than life persona that a religion is built around in, the persona of the survivor, and his anti-nobility feelings and his violence towards, the unjust rulers become synthesized into the culture, not only through the religion, but through the history of the final empire and, what harmony unfolds in the Alloy of Law. They talk about at various points that there's a kind of mandate to resist tyranny that has to do with the survivor, and that bloodshed is a part of that, and it's justified. When Miles is talking about his hatred for the corrupt rich people in Elendel, he cites the survivor. And we know that Miles is a villainous, evil character. And so it associates Miles with Kelsier and shows the ways in which these elements that Ruin incubated into Kelsier at this crucial moment become re-expressed in the culture over and over because Kelsier became such a central figure in reforming society. So Ruin's influence kind of echoes deep into the future thanks to Kelsier. And Kelsier's character is so fundamentally redefined in this short little story. there's not a whole lot of meat on the bone here, so to speak. Like, it's very short, and the story is pretty simple. There's a kind of antagonism and mistrust and feeling of uneasiness from Kelsier towards Gemmel, but at the same time, like, it's important that he learn from somebody who's teaching him, how his powers work. And Kelsier values that, but he's afraid of Gemmel. Like, he doesn't fully trust him. And he really wants to go back to the city and back to his crew where people understand him and, like, get his jokes. And he doesn't have to be constantly watching his back and worrying about, being attacked. And I think all of that's on purpose, that Ruin isn't just pushing Gemmel to kill Kelsier because he wants, everyone that he influences to murder the people around them all the time. Although, that is a factor. I think he wants Kelsier to be uncomfortable so that he does go back to his crew, because he wants that crew to do the heist where they steal the final empire from the Lord Ruler. That's a really important part of Ruin's plan. And so he doesn't want Kelsier to become attached to Gemmel. He wants him to be kind of pushed out of the nest, so to speak, so that he can go and bring those plans to fruit. In the story, Gemmel wants to get his hands on an 11th metal. And so everyone knows about the 10 metals that are, discussed in the first book of the Mistborn trilogy. But Gemmel's like, no, there's one more, and it has all of these special mystical powers, and it's so mysterious, and we need to go to this place to find it. And what we come into contact with is a kind of deranged Mistborn who is a scholar and a metallurgist who is searching for new metals to burn beyond the 10. And he's doing it by experimenting on the ska and like forcing them to ingest metals and then see if there is any kind of reaction. And it seems really clear that he is also in direct contact with Ruin. Ruin is like pushing him to do these things, and that he's brought all of these people together because he needs Kelsier to get the 11th metal here so that at the crucial moment they can understand who the Lord Ruler is and finally destroy him. And so there's all of this like subtle manipulation that Ruin is able to achieve. And because we've read, all of the stories up to this point, I think we can see the like deep sophistication, not only of Ruin in the plot, but like what Sanderson is doing here, that the story is working on multiple levels. So it's working for a brand new audience where there's just kind of a simple relationship between this clearly kind of deranged old man who's teaching Kelsier about these mysterious powers. And then, a kind of mad scientist who they steal this mysterious metal from. And then where is that going to go? Well, go read the trilogy to find out what happens next. That story works pretty successfully. But because we've put in, all of this time in the Cosmere, we can see that there's a much kind of vaster puzzle piece that's falling into place here. And so for such a short piece of fiction, it's really interesting to see, the way in which it fits into that larger mosaic. But I think it gives us a better insight into the influences in Kelsier's character and the way in which it like complicates that relationship, that I keep claiming that Kelsier is not a heroic good character, that he has these villainous aspects to him, and it puts him in this uncomfortable place in the kind of hierarchy of good and evil in the Cosmere. And so he ends up doing a good thing or participating in a good thing in overthrowing the final empire, in constructing a crew that he gives hope to and constructs this society, that lasts far into the future and helps rebuild civilization in terms of, the Church of the Survivor, and gives hope to all of these people. But that comes out of directly the plans of Ruin, whose, goals are to destroy everything in the universe. And so it's really suspicious that all of that would come from, this pure force of destruction. And so while that's not overtly stated in this story, I think it is so clearly there for the people who have read the Mistborn trilogy and even seen, like the stuff in the Stormlight archive that's showing us even more insight about the nature of these gods who are confined by these particular aspects that dominate their way of being. That Ruin can't do anything that doesn't have an end goal of, destroying everything. And so the fact that he put Kelsier on his path should be chilling to us. That, this could be a kind of revelation when you read the story and go like, oh, wait, I thought Kelsier was like a pure good guy who was martyred and cut down in his prime. But maybe, he was put in that place on purpose for bad reasons that haven't fully played out yet. So this is a cool little story. It echoes loudly, I think, throughout the Mistborn story for sure. And it's a big part of the reason why I make all of those claims about the way in which Kelsier is both a villain and a hero. And so I'm going to go on to another short story that was written after this, because Brandon Sanderson was deeply avoiding writing another Stormlight archive book because they are so massive and long. But he wrote this super cool story called The Emperor's Soul, and that's going to take us back to the same world of Elantris, but in a totally different part of the planet, if you will. And so that'll be the next thing that I move on to.